So hit the record button because I am going to put a recording up tonight um, for any classmates that did not attend our class. All right, so let's see if I can make this work. I downloaded the PowerPoint and then it was being funky about having me try and share it. But I'm going to figure it out. Oh, well, that's good. I checked. One more person wants in. Share screen. There we go. So yeah, a while back, can everybody see the screen? Are we good? I'm seeing nods, thumbs up. Thank you. So a while back, I made a presentation and I've kept it for a while. I'm not going to open it up as the big PowerPoint, so I hope you can see it because if I do that, then you hear me talking all through it. But I wanted to just talk through a couple quotes that I think are important and a couple strategies before you go into groups, so you can think about what I think is important and either argue that what I think is important you don't think is important. That's okay to do, or maybe you have pieces you want to add to the conversation, but just sort of to get us started tonight. So one of the quotes that I think a lot about it is the Paulo Freire quote, and I happen to be reading a book right now. I actually pulled it out. One of my favorite authors is Bell Hooks. She just died in the past year, but she wrote a book called Teaching to Transgress, Education as a Practice of Freedom. And she writes it somewhat through the eyes of a professor, but what she has to say could apply to pre-Kers. So if you're ever looking for another good book, and look, it's a nice short one too. It's not very long, but this is what Frostburg Department of Education, this has been our book study for this summer, her work. But one of the people that really influenced her work, and I was so excited when I was starting to read this book, she has an entire chapter dedicated to Paulo Freire, who's a quote in our work. And he says, the inextricable union between critical reflection on oppressive conditions and the social actions necessary to transform the world into a just and equitable place. And so I spend a lot of time in my work, and I actually, my research partner and I, my research partner is principal at North High, and we've been working for a lot of years now with this idea of critical reflection and what that looks like, and different ways to be reflective in our own practice. And so, not to go too far out there for you, but we've been trying to develop a reflective practice. He happens to be a painter, and so when we started working together, it was on his dissertation work, and he created a series of paintings that demonstrated his reflection on his ed leadership qualities. So now you might be going, that sounds way like out there. That sounds funky. So last year we sent a proposal in, and we've been trying for years to get into a conference that we just kept getting turned down. And finally we got accepted, and then COVID hit. So they keep stalling us out on the conference. Supposedly next summer will be our summer to go, but our paper is coming due. We will be a chapter in a book. So we have spent the last year, we thought what we were going to ask teachers, and I was going to ask you all, my students, to participate in last year. We believe that integrating the arts into our practice is part of reflection. And can be a really important part, rather than pen to paper, which is how probably most classes you've ever taken, and certainly if you did the discussion boards, what I'm really asking you to do there are reflections. But we've figured out a while back that in fact dialectical discourse is a reflective tool. So when I have you in groups and I have you discussing things, in fact, you are doing a reflective practice called dialectical discourse. So you can throw that word around now and tell people, oh yeah, I practice dialectical discourse. But it's the idea of sharing ideas and And then what do you glean out of those ideas that you've shared? What kind of feedback do you get, and what new insights do you get? But we had this idea that we were going to get all of our teachers and all of our students to be involved in arts education, and that not only we weren't necessarily saying that we were going to have every teacher implement the arts in their classes, but rather they would have an arts practice for themselves. The glitch became, I'm not really an artistic person. I don't have like something like my partner does. I'm not a painter. So I've been for the last year trying out different artistic practices, taken a dance class, tried singing, different things, trying to find my arts. And in fact, I have not landed on a single arts activity that I would tell you is my personal reflective practice. But in doing all of these activities, while thinking about my teaching, I have found I have new insights. And you might be like, what the heck does this have to do with being a more culturally relevant teacher? I would say to you that I believe the arts are a doorway into other people's lives and can be a great connector to your students. And so you might talk about that tonight in class a little bit, of how do you relate to students, and particularly our students that are different, come from different cultures, come from different ethnicities, and could the arts in some fashion be a connector? So now I'm going to tell you my quick story of being not a culturally relevant teacher. When I first started teaching, I taught self-contained special ed in Frederick County, Maryland. Middle school, I had 6th, 7th, and 8th graders all together, all different kinds of learning differences going on. But I had a student that was really big into rap music, really loved rap music. And I, at that time, didn't know a whole heck of a lot about rap music. Knew, the top hits, but didn't really know a lot about it. And he came into school one day very, very sad because Biggie Smalls had died. And I sort of made fun and said, I don't even know who Biggie, this is not a real person. Who would be named Biggie Smalls? And I really didn't buy into that this was really traumatic in his life. And so by lunchtime, he had found somebody's, and this will date me and tell you how old I am. He found somebody's CD Walkman and had me listening to Biggie Smalls. I'm here to tell you Biggie Smalls is real. But it was a definite growth moment for him and I, that I took an interest in what he was interested in, and that I could help relate with him in his life. Everything this kid did was a rap song. When he talked to me, it was in this rap kind of rhyme. Everything he did was in this. And I would say to him, what are we going to do in life? I would say that to all my students, and he was going to be a rapper. And I did the cardinal sin of saying, yes, but what's your plan B? The odds that you're going to make it as a rapper, we've got to have a plan for how, what we're going to do. Because I didn't know how to get him to a rap song. I didn't know how to do any of that kind of music. I didn't know how to get connections for him. I knew more practical things, like how he could become a construction worker, or how he could become, a truck driver, or those kinds of things. And he had no interest in those things. Sidebar conversation, he also liked to beat on my stomach when I was pregnant. He was convinced for quite a while it was a basketball, and that I had a basketball in my shirt, and I had to convince him it was not a basketball. So he then started rapping to my belly. Cut to, I bring this little tiny baby in, because I had my first son in June, right before the school year ended, and I take him into my classroom to see the new baby, because they've all kind of been with me through this experience. And the baby, of course, starts screaming and crying very, very loud. And nothing I could do was stopping it. And Aaron came over and started his rap songing to the baby that he had been rapping to all through my pregnancy. And instantly Liam stopped crying. I have no connection to this part of my story, but I find it very interesting. My Liam has grown up to be a hip hop music producer. I believe Aaron had a profound impact on my kid in utero, and it has led him down this path in life. So that ability to relate, take from that story what you want, but that ability to relate to the kids that you're teaching with will buy you so much credit with them, that you will be able to teach your curriculums that you need to teach. I truly, truly believe that. So I hold on to Freire's quote that inextricable union between critical reflection on oppressive conditions. My kids were living in some tough situations that I was teaching, and the social actions necessary to transform the world into a just and equitable place. That to me is the heart of being a culturally relevant educator. For that matter, a culturally relevant person that can relate to our neighbors. So I'm not gonna hang there too long, other than to say, my true belief with culturally responsive education, the key to it is the mindset and the ability to reflect and do that inside out work of looking, where do we stand, what do we believe, and then how can we relate back out to the populations that we work with. And this is where I think our Garcia and O'Donnell book really tie in for us. These are not easy tasks to take on a new position. So much like a sport, and right now I'm really trying to up my game in my yoga practice, but it could be any sport. Whenever you're learning something new, the beginning is just taking that pose. And in the beginning, you wobble a lot. I'm convinced there's this one yoga pose. I just was on vacation and I wanted to paddleboard, and I stink at paddleboarding. My best is if I get to my knees, I've done well. The standing part, I'm still falling off the board all the time. But I'm convinced that there's this one yoga pose that if I can learn to do the pose and hold it, I'm going to be able to get upright on the paddleboard, because it's all about the balance. It's all about keeping that balance. And I have terrible balance. But much like taking a new stance in our response to students, in our response to the people that we work with, and how we're going to relate to them, we have a wobble in the beginning. It's not just smooth. It doesn't just come naturally. But if we continue that practice, we get to the flow. And so that's much what I'm working on in my yoga pose, but it's also what I work on as a culturally responsive educator, that I'm constantly practicing. I haven't mastered it. And I've been teaching this course for a while. I've been learning about this for my entire career. And I would still tell you I'm not a master. So I want to give you permission to take a pose and wobble in it, and be okay with that. Take the chance, ask the questions, try things that are new and unique to you, and know that the rest of us around you are supporting you in that pose. So yeah, so I'm not gonna read through every slide to you, but I do love in our book the discussion about lizard brains. And so if you've been keeping up on the readings in Hammond and in Pose Wobble Flow, you know what I'm talking about right now, the lizard brain. I'm watching, oh, look at that, Christy's got lizard brain. No, you don't have lizard brain, you just know what I'm talking about.
I love the term. I thought it was great.
Yeah, it's this idea that when you try something new, your brain says, no, don't do it. Stay in the thing you know how to do. And you have to fight against that, because it's definitely taking your brain out of its comfort zone. So you have to keep practicing that. So this idea of reticular activating systems, your lizard brain will try every tactic it has to get you to go back to your old ways. And you think about anything in your life where you've tried to create new habits. Our brains try and trick us back into the thing we've mastered. and it fights against us learning something brand new that goes against that practice. So yeah, so I think about that a lot because there are moments where I definitely have some lizard brain. And I definitely want you to think about this quote. And I think about it a lot. I cannot know what life is like for a young person of color, as a queer youth, or even growing up poor in today's world. But I can learn as much as I can and develop a team to support me. I think that is key. You know, I've talked a little bit in this class about most of us that go into education, we tend to be typically white middle-class women. And so sometimes it can be difficult to relate. And I don't want you to feel like you can't do it or that you have to have a direct experience. You may or may not. What you can do is keep learning. And what you can do is find a team that's going to support you in that learning. And if the people around you are not supportive of you wanting to be a more culturally responsive educator, find a new team. I think that is the important part. Often in our school settings, and I can say this when I taught in the classroom, and I can say this when I went to the university, I thought the university was going to be just full of people that wanted to be culturally responsive. Nope, that was not necessarily the case. We got a lot of lizard brains in higher ed. So I had to keep looking.
West Virginia, some of them.
But
Panhandle, some of them. PA, some of them.
Sorry, I unmuted myself.
Mostly Maryland.
Hopefully that stopped it. All right, hopefully that stopped. Sorry. And then that ability to learn how to prepare white students so that we do not replicate racism. I taught in a city school, and then I've taught in a rural school, and my fellow teachers in the rural school would be like, why is this important for us to be talking about other cultures and ethnicities? You know, we're a predominantly white school. That was the very reason it was important, because our world is not only white students. And so the ability to know that there's all this rich culture out there to learn about and know about is huge. Finally, my last plug to you, and then I'm gonna stop my slides for the evening. Though I love this particular PowerPoint. If you haven't watched it, it might be worth your time. I would say to you, just in thinking, it is a constant examining of your own belief systems. We have those surface beliefs, we have shallow kind of cultural beliefs, and then we have deep cultural beliefs that sometimes are hard to dig into. But if we routinely interpret other people's actions through a personal cultural frame, we can misinterpret the actions and intentions. So if you think about times where you maybe have been in a workplace struggle, oftentimes it's a misinterpretation of other people's actions and intentions. And those are the conversations. If you can get to that place and have those conversations, real change in your work setting can happen. So I just encourage you in those areas, because these are tough conversations. These are not easy and light and just easy places to go sometimes. So one of my favorite strategies in dealing with that, and I used to, in the summer, I can't do this activity, but in the fall, in the spring, I often do an activity where I'll exchange one of your assignments and ask you in exchange for that assignment to go talk to somebody that you really don't like. And the purpose of that is to grow a relationship, a professional working relationship with someone, and using the SOTA strategy. But I would encourage you that this strategy works really well in the classroom when you're having a conflict with a student or with a colleague. And the whole idea is to stop and pause and to actually say to yourself, okay, I'm going to have an open mind. I'm going to think about this in a different way. And then to just observe for a bit. I like the 10-second rule. I like to take in the environment. I like to take a breath. And then I deliberately detach from the moment. where I'll walk away, I'll get a drink, I might think about it, take the night, but redirect my energy in a different way. And then you get to go to that awakening moment where become present in the moment and try and see the other person and their feelings. I'm a person that can be very reactionary. So this has been a great strategy for me. When I see something that I think is going wrong, or somebody that's not understanding, not just my point of view, but is not embracing whatever change may be happening around us, I can get pretty sharp. Using this strategy has helped me kind of take a step back and take a moment to try and see where the other person's perspective and viewpoint is coming from. It doesn't mean that I've adopted their viewpoint. It doesn't mean I agree with their viewpoint, but it's given me a moment to pause and rethink. So I highly encourage, like, if you're going to save anything out of this class, download this PowerPoint and keep it. So, or if you have your O'Donnell Garcia book, it is in there. That's a strategy that's in the book. So I definitely encourage that strategy. The other strategies that I think are important to be culturally responsive, one is to organize your thinking. So that goes back to that reflection piece. And that's why I spend so much of my time doing that reflective work. Because if you're not clear about what it is you do believe, it's very easy to get swayed. And when you're trying to change some of the things that you might believe into new viewpoints, if you're not organized in your own thinking, it can get very easy to grab hold of whatever the next big idea is, or to get swayed by another person's point of view. Don't be overwhelmed by your thinking, like you have to master each area to be competent. Remember, we are all in that pose and wobble all the time. Getting to flow is very hard. And give yourself protection time for reflection. What I mean by that is carve out, when are you going to do it? I think teachers are notorious for two places of reflection: when they take a shower and when they drive in their car. I think we do it all the time. But what you might consider doing is turning on the recorder on your phone so that it records, and actually having an out loud conversation with yourself. Even if you just do it once a week, and then to make time that you're going to listen back to what it is that was important to you. Because so often when we're doing that reflection, we don't really have a way to record and keep track of it. And so then they just become random ideas that, have you ever had this happen? Like 2 days later, you're like, I had this great idea, but now I can't remember it. So just finding a way to record yourself. And there's such good tools that if you download Google on your phone, it's one of my favorites. Is it's so easy to record and it'll transcribe it for you. There's an app within Google that'll transcribe. So now you've got basically a journal that you're keeping with your words, but you could always just play the recording back to yourself. And then find colleagues for accountability and support. So my research partner and I, we are each other's accountability and support system. I cannot tell you the number of times I go to North High and I get to his office and he spends his time telling me about what's been happening at North High and what his plan is for the school and for the teachers. And we have trouble getting to the writing part of our work because we spend the whole time, and I'm there saying, well, but did you think about this for your teachers? Are you putting too much on their plate? How are you going to make this planning system work? He's got a really cool idea that's going to happen next year at North High, and I'm so excited about it. A real practice of co-teaching, pulling together co-teaching models. But I'm there kind of punching the holes in it, talking about, okay, but you got to think about these things that are going to happen for teachers. So finding that, and he does the same for me, by the way. And then it's practice. But I wouldn't want you to leave this class thinking that you're going to be, you've now become a culturally responsive educator. You're going to be steps closer, just like I'm steps closer, but we're always working on the practice. And then the last thing I'm posting, the last slide talks about Postman and Weingartner. And I think this is really, really important. There's no such thing as an apolitical position. Choosing not to disrupt the status quo is itself a political choice. I'm not talking about Democrats and Republicans here. I'm not talking about primary elections or general elections. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when you see something happening that needs to change and you know it, staying quiet just keeps that status quo. And so you've made a political choice not to be involved. Just like when you choose to disrupt, you've made a political choice. In fact, we see it as a capitulation in this heavily mandated era when it seems that being posed is the only option. Adopting a culturally proactive pose is not only a subversive activity, but a moral imperative. Now, if you're sitting there saying to yourself, I'm not sure being subversive is a good thing. I've never heard that word used in this manner. I'm here to tell you that subversion can be a very positive impact on you, on your mental health as an educator, on your ability to take culturally responsive stances. But you have to know your system that you're working in. And so in this context, what we're talking about is you got to know your system and then how you're going to do the workaround so that you can be fulfilled and feel good about your practice as a culturally responsive educator. Doing nothing is not culturally responsive. And so what Postman and Weingarten are saying is it's not only important, it's a moral imperative to take these stances. So, okay, now I'm going to get off my soapbox with you. Open up my big screen. So that's sort of my backstory before we jump into our two discussions tonight. So I'm looking for my screen. Hold on a sec. Where did my screen go? There it is. Oh, I have my questions open. Hold on just a sec. Of course, my screen disappeared that I wanted. Discussions. All right, can everybody still see the screen? So my response on module 3, I was a little long-winded because as I stated in this particular lesson, I broke one of my rules, which was to post to you what I think. I try not to do that ahead of time because sometimes that can sway the conversation. But I really do live by the principles that building community and connecting to social justice movements, encouraging and amplifying youth voice, learning through models and authentic practice, and then grappling with social justice issues. Those pieces for me, and I think for many of us, can be the guiding, they're kind of my guideposts. I think about my community, I think about youth voice, I think about modeling authentic practice, and then I'm constantly grappling with social justice issues. And I think as educators, we need to be open to that. So I'm interested in you having a first conversation about where you stand in this idea of trying to be a culturally relevant educator, and then how do you see those principles of neuroscience influencing your teaching and learning, and what brain rules guide your lesson planning, and or your own self-directed learning? What rules do you follow? And then that's module 3. And I'm sorry, my dogs have decided to play right in front of my computer. So they're making noise. Oh, look, as soon as I said that, they stopped. And then discussion 4. I want you to think about how you can learn about more about what would help your future students or athletes or people under your guidance feel safe and trusting from their own personal perspectives. So how do you make sure that their own perspectives and experiences are safe in your presence, whether it's a classroom, whether it's coaching, whether it's school counseling, whether it's working in some part of the university? I know there's a couple of you that are university folk. So how do you create that sense of trust and safety with your relationships? And then how would you manage potential cultural conflicts around respect and trust? So those are our questions that we're working with tonight. Before I put you into groups, are there any questions or thoughts you want to share before we go into groups? Everybody's here. All right. So I'm gonna put us into groups. We're gonna be there at 7:32. So I'm gonna let you hang out in there till about 7:50, unless I hear conversations wrapping up. Sound good? We're good? All righty. There you go. Rooms are open. Is it even back? My students are in their breakout rooms, which I have to join, but I don't need to join right now.
Let's say you are teaching these like children like something just by talking, like just talking. There are some children that they learn like they're like visual learners, you know what I mean? So it's not fair, as I repeated before, saying, oh, you're so intelligent, you know what I mean? It's like they have like kids, they have their own different way on learning things, you know what I mean? Maybe music, it would be like their like main, area, or others visual. So it is important as a teacher, we have all those like tools, like resources for them, you know what I mean? I'm taking one class right now, and I remember my professor, he sent a survey at the beginning. How do you learn the material? You know what I mean? Like reading it, audio, you know what I mean? So I was like, I found that very interesting that he sent that survey before the class starts. So, yeah.
I come at it kind of from that trauma perspective, like Miranda had mentioned, because my whole career has been in alternative ed. So I'm really focused on, why are these kids struggling in their comprehensive environments? They get sent to me, and we talk about ACEs and all that stuff. And what stood out to me, I think from Hammond, I think that's where you got your brain layers, Miranda, where she talks about how if the learning environment is at all stressful or inattentive, that learning is impossible. Like your amygdala will just shut you down. So if a kid walks into your room and there's microaggressions, or they don't feel welcome, or it feels, prison-like because the teacher's not creative or doesn't make the environment welcoming, they don't see anything that relates to them, then they can't even walk through that door and access what you're trying to give them. If a kid's coming in, like you said, with trauma and stress and all that stress hormone as opposed to oxytocin.
Talked and they were like, oh, that's so weird. And it's like, it's weird only because it's different to you. To them, it's normal. And that's something that's just, it's a way of life. Different isn't bad. Different is just a different perspective. So there's a lot of talks about just because it's different doesn't mean it's weird. And weird is not always bad. Sometimes they do it better.
Yeah.
Well, I actually read a book back in June about brain health. And so it was kind of interesting that some of what I read in the book kind of correlated with one of the chapters in, I think it was the Hammond book. And it talked about like cortisol, like that hormone that's released whenever we're stressed. And it's very interesting to just kind of think about how, like, if our classroom isn't a safe place for students to come in and learn, then, and if they're not feeling safe, or if they're not feeling welcomed in the classroom, then maybe that cortisol hormone can be released. And then whenever there's like high amounts of that released, then that leads to depression or anxiety, headaches, memory loss. So there's really no learning that takes place if those things are happening. And I'm actually glad that you said that you teach middle school, because I was kind of wondering, like, how, if it's hard for you to establish like a nurturing relationship, a caring relationship with your students, because I teach 4th grade. And so my students are in my care all day long, other than when they go to resource. So it's easier for me to establish a relationship with them. I mean, it might take a little bit longer for some students to trust me, but like when you're teaching high school and middle school, those kids are only in your care for a set amount of time each day, and maybe only every other day. So I guess my question when I was doing all this is it harder? I would think it is, but that's just my opinion. Is it more difficult for you as a middle school teacher to establish a relationship with your students? Because honestly, like, kids aren't dumb. Like, kids know whether you genuinely care about them or not. And so, like, do you find it difficult to kind of like foster a relationship with your students because you only see them for a short period of time?
That's a great question. I feel like I learned the importance of relationships the second we went online. And just, talking, just the whole pandemic.
A while ago. So I'm trying to like think back to what all. Oh, I did right here. Cultural neuroscience can be changed by the environment. So I do think that it too, like kids that come into school with their development is based upon what the environment is they're coming from and what life experiences they've already established. And you can tell the difference between those kids that have been exposed to like going to like zoos and going to different having the experiences with their family versus the kids that aren't developmentally as developed because they haven't had those experiences. Does that make sense?
Well, and even having parents that read to them versus students that don't, that's so huge.
Exactly.
I can tell you of my 11 reading intervention high school students, I maybe 1 or 2 had families that read to them. And I would bet money on that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you're right. All the different experiences and exposures.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like It goes as back far as their speech, their, like you said, their lifelong reading, their lifelong like social emotional. It almost hits all those domains by what environment they are born into. I'm like a huge advocate for like early intervention, and that's not only because I work with little kids, but that's just because I feel like that's their brains growing so much quicker at that small amount of time, that whatever you can jam in there in that little amount of time and whatever you can fix and tweak, and it sets them for the rest, if that makes sense. I feel like a lot of the times this past school year, I think it's because a lot of the kids I worked with were so delayed from COVID, because the kids I worked with were 3 years old. So they were born into almost COVID. So I feel like I was able to see so many developmental things unfold right before my eyes this year. So it was like, it was pretty remarkable.
I think one thing that's really like interesting from as like reading some of the module pieces was kind of like different articles from different kind of eras of this short era of understanding cultural neuroscience and those pieces and how they interact. It made me think a little bit about like on my end of things and like motor learning, how much like of our research is based on like male subjects. And like I work with an all women's team, like an all women's team, the easiest way to say it. But so for me, like I think that it made me think a lot about like the motor learning that I'm studying and trying to understand, and the neuroscience that I'm trying to understand in the context of like sport learning, like how much of that is actually super specific to my athletes, because we know where there's a little more built out research on like the sociological side, this idea of like team dynamics and team culture. There's a lot of research that looks at the differences between men's and women's sports teams and how they like bond. But I haven't really seen nearly as much research on the side of the actual like motor learning, sport learning side of things. So when I talk about all these different like ways that I've learned to understand how like they've done all these studies on cueing, I would venture to guess, although I can't necessarily say I've pulled up every article and looked at, what the study participants were. They were all very much I would bet they are almost all white men, and particularly men in terms of sports in general, at least, is kind of where things tend to trend on the research side of things. So yeah, it's just like an interesting that as you watch like these pieces emerge that weren't talked about, that were researched at all not that long ago, it definitely makes you think about what I'm basing my teaching on that hasn't actually been researched in an adequate way at this point now.
Sure.
Emma, you are making a really important point. And this is something like sports is a good spot to talk about it. I mean, because it's so blatant in sports. But in general, like when you look at even like in my world, special education research, so much of the research is geared around boys and doesn't specifically, and as we're learning about the brain development, it's not all studies. It's like you said, I haven't read every study that there is, but so much of it, the participants are boys and not girls.
And so many of those studies then are presented as like a blanket statement,
right?
As particularly on the sports side of thing, like this is what you should do for all your students because we studied all students in this study, which just isn't the truth. Like
exactly. That's a very good point.
I wanted to say something too quickly about the cultural neuroscience that I actually jotted down. This was from the website article, This is Your Brain on Culture. I wrote this sentence: East Asians and Americans literally see things differently. That case study where they looked at MRIs and, Americans being so culturally centralized on ourselves, Asians not, literally see things differently. And that hit me. Like, I mean, I'm sure I kind of thought that way. I know that America is very, America, we like ourselves a lot. But that sentence just really stuck out to me because I thought, well, I've got students from different cultures. North High is a very varied school. I got to remember that. That's a new thing to me as a teacher. I got to remember that people perceive things differently, think of things differently than I do. So
I
that was
saw
kind of eye-opening.
Yeah, I saw an explanation and it made me think of that article. Like the other day, it might have been on like TikTok, I don't even know. But it was like they were talking about this study that they did in like Thailand, where they showed these images of these like 3 different scenes and asked the participants to describe them, and they looked at it from like Thai perspective and then like foreigner perspectives. And the foreigners, like all like that were from like non-tropical climates, noticed a clock and what time it was in all 3 photos, because they were like, in non-tropical climates it matters, like time really matters, because you have to be like ready for fall, ready for spring. And in tropical climates, like there's the same like basically like produce available to you year round, or the same kind of growing, like the
It's
cycle
not.
kind of is continuous, so time doesn't matter as much. And it, like I feel like I was very much like, oh, I just read an article about this same
Yeah.
concept, but like to even think about just like watching the clock versus not in a classroom is such a big thing. The way people talk about watching a clock in a classroom, just interesting.
I
Well,
had kind
And Emma, I would, that kind of makes you think about in a classroom, if you have students that are struggling with time management, we're so quick to say it's ADD or ADHD or they're disorganized, when in fact, there may be an ethnic or cultural influence that we're not even taking into consideration.
Absolutely. I mean, in my own experience in athletics, like coming into college, my first college team was like pretty much all Black coaches and majority Black like team, or Black and like African immigrant team members. And I was like so confused why no one, like we just started practice when everyone was ready. Like there wasn't a super specific time that we started practice. And to me, like it was such a huge deal in high school. I would have such, I was like a very anxious kid. I would be so worried about being to practice, like, 15 minutes early is on time, and anything after is late in Smithsburg world, in where I grew up. And like, I was like so confused why you could just like come when you were ready to show up, and we all got started when everyone was ready. And it worked. Like, and it was like so mind-blowing to me that the team functioned still without these super rigid time concepts. And it was definitely like a change in my mindset that influenced me then as a coach, where even when I am very particular at times about like when we show up and when we start, I also make sure to communicate my why, because it's not just like a universally like, this is important to everyone, obviously you have to be on time. It's not obvious. And so like, if there's a time where I really need them to be ready at a particular time, I explain to them why that's important and why it's respectful to everyone, because it's not just like time is not just like a moral concept that is universally on time good. Like, so yeah.
But it stands to reason. I think I kind of equate it, maybe this is a bad analogy, but I think about people that when you talk to somebody from a different part of the country, they have a dialect, right? The first time I went home with my husband to Minnesota, they just loved my Southern accent. And I say to my husband, I don't have a Southern accent. Like, go to Alabama, they have a Southern accent. Right. But as far as Minnesota was concerned, I was Southern. And Maryland is a Southern state. I don't think of Maryland as a Southern state. Our own, because we live here and we live in it, we don't even recognize our own cultural nuances.
right.
So to your point about time management, think of how often a kid gets in trouble for being late to the sport practice, and they may not have had any idea.
Yeah. And that's one of my biggest issues with like people I've coached with before, who kind of just have that same, like, this is the only way to show up to practice. Like, you should already have learned this. You should know this. Like, I'm mad at you because you're late. That's all the explanation that's needed. And it's one of just setting expectations in general, I think is ultra important. If there's something that's important to you, being able to communicate that on the front end and not expect everyone to understand that. in the sports setting feels very important to me, because I think a lot of times it is that like they miss culturally how some people just weren't worried about, have never been asked that or been worried about that, because it's culturally specific to you as the coach. And I think
I'm writing a note to myself right now to look for research on, I wonder how the words teachers, educators, coaches, how that is defined in other cultures. I know how we define it in the US. Well, how are those roles, we talk a lot stereotypically that, in Asian countries, teachers are so revered. Well, but how is their practice different than our practice? Why is that? What, I'm going to have to do some research, Emma.
I was saying about the cultural, I'm taking a Orton Gillingham training right now. Christy, I don't know if you have that training.
I know what I know a lot of the components. I just
Yeah.
finished a Wilson training, so.
Oh gosh. Well, it's very overwhelming, but we were talking about like cultural differences, like in how we pronounce sounds, that we have to accept that those different sounds come from different cultures, and we can't change that because of their culture, which is important. But it's like it's really hard as educators to figure out, is this a delay, or is this something developmental, or is this like culturally? So you really have to know like your students and their background.
Absolutely.
To be able to teach them, your reading like you do, Christy, and
Hello. So some very interesting conversations going around. We went a little bit over, but I'm going to try very hard, keep us focused. I don't want to take us too long tonight. So there was conversations about how students learn material. I was really impressed. This group in particular, I can't say this is scientific research I'm collecting on you, but anecdotally, you used more brain terminology than I've heard other groups using. So that excites me, because that is a goal of mine. If you had me in ed research, I'm trying to move away from theorists and move more into what we know about the brain, because I think that is more reliable information to use, evidence-based and research-based learning versus a theory. Not that theories don't have their place, they do. So that was exciting to hear all the different, I was hearing amygdala and cortisol levels, and every group I heard a different terms. So yay, we're starting to use science as part of our discussion on cultural practices and our students. But conversations about how students learn material and how trauma affects learning. I was hearing I liked this when I wrote this down. I think it was Elise that said this: different is not weird, and weird is not bad. So I'm gonna quote you on that one and give you credit as I use that phrase, because I like that one a lot. But I could see that blown up in a classroom, looking lovely. Difference is not weird, and weird is not bad. That's cool. I was hearing about brain health and how do we establish relationships, particularly across grade levels, and the differences between elementary and middle and high school. There was some really nice conversations going on about that early learning and the impact, and why we need to get parents to understand why they need to read to their kids. And by the way, I'm a fan of read anything. Read the cereal box, read the soup label, read anything to your kids. I'm big on, I think I may have talked to you all about my little hub project. Like, we're giving books away every time parents come. Take some books, and then modeling for parents, reading a book to a kid, because it doesn't just come naturally to everyone, and not every culture, by the way, understands that importance of reading the way we do here. There was a wonderful conversation going on about the differences between cultures and what's important. And the connection was made to a study. I think this was Emma talking about this, of subtropical regions and then others, people that weren't from subtropical regions, and showing them a picture. And everyone in the picture from non-subtropical regions picked the clock as being important to the picture. And the subtropical folks, they didn't pick the clock, because time wasn't what was their number one. But other cultures, we are very focused on being on time and that structure in our world. Think of how that impacts a class. If you have kids that are from other areas where time is not as important, timeliness is not as important to their culture, that would be a learning they need to understand. In America, we're really big on timeliness, and why that's important. And then there was I'm going to give Emma credit on this one too, but there was a conversation about who was in the study. And what I mean by that is sometimes we get studies, we get things presented to us that are research, and in fact, the population or the participants may not look like us. Meaning, Zach, just happens to be a fact. Oftentimes it's white males that are in the study, but then we attribute the findings to all of us, and it may not apply. So that's a really important point to always ask that question: who was in the study? Participants are important to understanding of that study. So really, really good conversations occurring tonight. This is one that could go on for a while. I want to show you. Oh, please open. I want to show you, if I can find it, give me just a sec. I had pulled a presentation that was really good and I wanted to show it to you. And I think I downloaded it. Give me just 1 second. Something happens every time I open my my Zoom classroom. It makes all my other windows go small. But if you can give me just a minute, I will have it back up. And of course, my computer wants to be a titch slow now that I want something to come up. All right, here we go. The wheel is spinning. All right, here we go. So I'm going to put a couple examples up on our announcement board, but I wanted to just show you this one this evening. This was McKenna Booker's, and it was a really great presentation. She studied United States, Finland, and Afghanistan. And there was a couple things I wanted to point out that she did nice, that I really liked. So your 5 areas are language instruction, networking, implementation, and innovation, teacher supports and resources, global experiences for students and educators, and overall education systems. So those are the areas that you should be studying for your 3 countries. So I want to say a couple things before I forget to say it. One, try and focus your research, what you're looking for. Otherwise, you're going to have so much information, even in third world countries like Afghanistan, developing countries. There can be a plethora of information, and it makes it really hard for you to focus. And this assignment could be overwhelming. So try and keep your focus. And again, if your background is you're a coach, then look at the sports in those countries and how do they, have high school sports or have, team sports for kids. What does that look like? You don't have to base it around solely education thinking about reading, writing, etc. But you do need to look at these categories because these skills, language instruction, networking, teacher supports, global experiences, these are considered 21st century skills, meaning that all of us should be getting experiences in language instruction. So like we can say, well, does the United States, are we dual language? The answer is no. But you may find pockets or places where that is occurring. Networking. So how are we sharing our resources? That's what this isn't a computer question, though technology can be part of the answer. But this is really about shared resources and innovative practices in our work. And then what kind of supports and resources are given to teachers? And what kinds of global experiences do students and educators have? Countries, for example, like Finland, they support and pay for their teachers to have global experiences, to do travel. Whereas in the United States, it's kind of small pockets that occurs. In Afghanistan, that's not occurring at all because they barely have education for their students. But so those are your categories. And you can see how McKenna put hers together. She started off with her Venn diagram of just quick facts about each country that she put together. For example, Afghanistan's considered the unhappiest country in the world, whereas Finland's considered the happiest country in the world. US kind of falls somewhere in the middle of that. And then she chose to focus on each country as she went through. So she started with the United States, and then she went to Afghanistan, and then she went to Finland. Each of her slides, she had several topics. Like, so for here, she had the overall education, her language instruction, her global experience. And then she put networking and teacher supports on the next slide. So you can see, like for Finland, there was lots of information, but she kept it to 3 slides, and one was a title slide. So don't feel like you have to tell me everything in the world that there is to know about Finland's education system. You do not. You need to be able to answer the overall question of overall education. Like what are the requirements in Finland? Well, in Finland, you're only mandated to go to school through grade 9. Now, we hear all the time how smart Finland is and how they're #1 in schools. But when you read about them, you'll see part of why that is in the way that their school day is set up, their education system. And by the way, not for nothing, Finland has virtually no diversity. They have no immigration policy, meaning you are not allowed to stay in the country. They do not have immigrants coming to the country and staying. It's not part of their education system. So why is the United States struggling with our school scores? Not because we have immigration, but we have a very wide variety of students attending our schools. In Finland, they don't test their kids in special education. They're not part of that overall population. They don't believe in least restrictive environment. The way freedom is so central to the United States that it's even part of our school system. We believe in keeping our kids included in classrooms, and they're part of our test data. So when we fall at 22nd in a math score, remember, we've tested all of our kids, not just the smartest kids, like Finland does, by the way. I'm going to knock on Finland tonight. But then she went through her final slide. She looks at her personal reflections, and then she does a reference slide. That is her presentation. It's not that long. I think her overall slides, she had 15 slides. I would say that's a nice length. You can do it in about 15 slides. But hers was one I thought I wanted to show you tonight, particularly when we're in a summer class. This can be a kind of feel like an overwhelming assignment. I truly mean this when I say this. I love this assignment. I think it's a great assignment. You're going to learn a lot of information. If you haven't started already, you might want to get started because it's due pretty soon. But if you've spent more than a weekend on this project, you've spent too much time. I'm dead serious about that. This can be an overwhelming project. You could study this all semester and still not have all the information. So stay really focused on those areas right? Those 21st century learn skills. Stay really focused in on that and find some answers to it, knowing that it's not a complete answer. Is that helpful? Good. All right, we're at 8:07. Does any questions, comments for the group, concerns? So we see each other again on, I'm looking at my schedule. Today's Thursday. So we don't see, we see each other next week on the 11th. Oh, we're back-to-back weeks now because we're coming into the home stretch. So we're going to see each other on the 11th. We are going to be focused in on modules 5 and 6, but remember, module 5 is the Twitter. So tonight, tomorrow, probably tonight, I'm going to tweet our questions out. And so you can answer anytime between now and then. Good for everyone, good for the group. All right, then we can call it a night. It was great to see everybody. I'll hopefully see everybody again next week. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.